So you might have experienced some version of complete silence after a fight. Whether you or your partner stopped answering, maybe even left the room, or maybe physically present, yes, but completely emotionally unreachable, giving one-word answers or avoiding eye contact or doing anything except actually talking. What I've seen sitting with couples over the years in my practice, and what I want to talk about today is how complete and dead silence after a fight is not needing space or cooling down. If you're new here, I'm Adrian, I'm a couples therapist, and I help you build emotionally mature relationships your parents didn't get to have. Let's dive in. There's a story what we tell ourselves about going quiet, and it might even sound reasonable on the surface level. I shut down when I'm overwhelmed, I can't help it. Or some version of, if I keep talking, it will just escalate, so I'll just stay silent. And here is what I want to say carefully. Some of that is true. There are moments in conflict where actually continuing to talk does more damage. Taking a pause, or what we in therapy call structured timeout, can actually be healthy. And I'm not talking about that here. I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about the silence that is palpable, the type of silence that you can actually feel in the space between you two. To me, for example, when it was happening a long time ago in my relationship, it felt like a space filled with jelly. Jelly you can actually cut through. You know, just that feeling of density. Like both of you have something to say, but nobody's talking. So the difference between the two, the complete and utter silence and structured timeout, is not actually behavior, because both means we are leaving the conversation. But a timeout has a return. It has the part when one says, I need 30 minutes or 20 minutes to have a little break, and I can come back to this. So it's temporary and it's communicated, and we call that responsible distancing. So I will make a distance from you, from this conversation, but I will do it in a way where I will include you. The silent treatment, on the other hand, has none of that. It just happens. And it ends when it ends. Who knows? The person on the receiving end doesn't know when. Let me share a useful example from a couple in my practice I used to work with a long time ago. So every time they argued, he would go completely silent after a few heated sentences. And sometimes he would even sleep in the other room. He would respond to her questions with one word. He would walk past her in the kitchen, sometimes like she wasn't even there. And this could go on for 2-3 days. And she would spend those days in complete emotional panic. And she would try everything to break through. Talking about house chores, friends, or outing they planned together. But he would continue with the silent treatment. So when he and I worked on this in one of the sessions, the first thing he said was, I just need time. I can't talk when I'm upset. And I believe that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Because when we went deeper, what we found was that the silence was the only place in that moment where he actually felt safe. When he was silent, she couldn't hurt him any further. She couldn't say anything else that would blame him. And this is the part that he didn't even admit it to himself up to that moment. When he was silent, he had control. And for the first time in that argument, he felt like he had the power, because what the arguments replicated in some way was his relationship with his loud and often angry father, the father who never listened. And so when he fought with his girlfriend, she reminded him of his father. She was that person for him, and he would do the only thing he knew how: to shut down. And you might hear some call this stonewalling. There's a research by Dr. John Gottman, who studied couples for decades, that identifies stonewalling as one of the 4 most destructive patterns in any relationship, alongside criticism, contempt, and defensiveness. He calls them 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Stonewalling is often the most dangerous one because it shuts down any possibility of repair. And what makes it particularly hard to address is that the person doing it often doesn't even experience it as an aggression. They experience it as a survival. They are flooded emotionally overwhelmed, and the silence is how their nervous system protects itself. But their partner doesn't see it as a survival. They experience it as an abandonment. And here's what I want you to understand what prolonged silence does. And not because of one argument, but across months and years of relationship. It teaches your partner that you're not safe to be honest with. Think about of a perspective of the clients I mentioned before. Every time she said something that upsets him, even something she had every right to express, I mean, every relationship has friction, the consequence is days of emotional exile. So what does she learn? She learns to monitor herself. She learns to soften things that might not need softening. She learns to ask herself, is this worth 3 days of silence? Before she says anything real, anything of concern. And slowly, without either of them consciously deciding this, the relationship becomes a place where she can't be fully herself, where she edits herself, where she performs okayness because the cost of not being okay is too damn high. And this is how couples end up feeling like roommates. Not because they stopped loving each other, but because one person, usually without even knowing it, trained the other person that honesty is dangerous. Confronting things is dangerous. And the other thing silence does over time is build resentment, because nothing ever actually gets resolved. The argument itself that triggered the silence is never properly addressed. The need behind it is never spoken about after. So it sits and waits until it comes back, usually as the same argument with slightly different packaging. So I want to give you something practical here. If you recognize yourself as the person who goes silent, the first thing I want you to do is to get curious about what's happening in you right before you shut down. Most people who stonewall have very clear physical experience just before it happens. A kind of a shutdown feeling where you would want to escape, to get away from this place, from this conversation. And that moment just before the silence is where the work is. What you're experiencing in that moment is something you might have heard of. It's called flooding. No matter what the name is, the physical experience is your heart rate is spiked, your nervous system is in a stress response, and your capacity for rational conversation is like close to zero. That is real. It is physiological, not just emotional. But the response to flooding, it doesn't have to be silence. It can be a sentence. Something like, I'm feeling really overwhelmed right now and I need 20, 30 minutes. I'm not going anywhere. I'm just going to be in another room, or I'm going for a walk around the block. I just need to regulate, and then I want to come back to this. Because you see, in this sentence, you're not blaming anyone. You're not blaming yourself. You're not blaming your partner. It is just, I recognize what this is, and I'm not going to repeat what I grew up with, which is kind of superpower if you look at it that way. We're all here on this planet to get to know ourselves better, one step at a time. That sentence does everything that silent treatment does. It creates space, it stops the escalation, but it does one thing that silent treatment never does. It keeps the other person in the loop, instead locked outside of it. And for the person on the receiving end, I want to say something that it might be unpleasant to hear. Chasing someone who has gone silent almost always makes the situation worse. I know the panic that comes with it. I know how unbearable it is to be shut down by the person you love. So that's why when things have calmed, be honest about what it does to you. Not as an accusation, just as an information. Something like, when you go silent, I feel frightened and alone. And it reminds me of, and insert here what this reminds you of, I would guess that it reminds you of the feeling of being abandoned. Probably because you experienced some form of it. It doesn't have to be physical abandonment. It doesn't have to be that someone actually left you. It can be an emotional abandonment, which is almost equally painful. That conversation is very important. And it has to happen when both of you are calm and outside of fight. That is what creates change. The silent treatment persists in relationships because it works in short term. It stops the immediate pain, but it works like painkillers work on a broken bone. The pain goes away, yes, but the bone doesn't heal. And every time you do it, the damage goes a little deeper. To trust or to feel safe. The relationships I've seen that actually change are the ones where both partners get curious about their own pattern. What this reminds me of? What am I actually protecting? And what am I afraid of? What is my biggest fear when it comes to you? Those questions, asked with honesty, will take you further than any technique I can give you. If this resonated with something in your relationship, I would encourage you to share it with your partner, not as a message, but as an opening. I've watched this and it made me think about us. Can we talk? And if you want to see what bringing previous arguments into your current argument does to your relationship, see you in this video.